Hello Year 12s and welcome to this video on global considerations in operations management. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to take notes. Use the rewind function if you need to go back over any information contained in this video. The third thing that you need to do is have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheets the definitions of key terms or of any other words that you may be unfamiliar with. And the fourth thing that you need to do is to have your summary books open in front of you. As we go through this video, I will give you some guidance as to what you should include in your summary books. Once you've finished watching this video, please make sure that you read the pages from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Our learning intention for this video is that you should be able to describe global considerations in operations management, including global sourcing of inputs, overseas manufacture, global outsourcing, and an overview of supply chain management. In this video, we're looking at supply chains, and in particular at supply chains where one or more elements of the supply chain is located overseas. A supply chain is a system of organizations, people, activities, information, and resources that are involved in moving inputs from suppliers to producers and outputs from producers to consumers. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term supply chain and write this definition in there. You can see that there are 3 types of participants in a supply chain. The first type of participant is the suppliers, who supply the inputs, for example, the raw materials and component parts that are needed to produce the finished product, that is, the output. The second type of participant are the producers, that is, manufacturers. These are the participants who make the finished product. And the third type of participant is the consumers, that is, the customers who buy the finished products. Our learning intention requires you to have a broad understanding of supply chain management. By looking at global considerations in operations management and the advantages and disadvantages of having elements of the supply chain located overseas, you will gain this understanding of supply chain management. Supply chain management refers to meeting customer demand for goods and services while making the most efficient use of inputs, producing the finished product in the most efficient way, and distributing the finished product to customers in the most efficient way. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term supply chain management and write this definition in there. You'll note that effective supply chain management involves 2 requirements. The first requirement is the requirement to meet customer demand for the goods and services produced by the business. The second requirement is the requirement for the supply chain to operate efficiently, that is, cost effectively, through minimizing the cost of inputs, the cost of producing the outputs, and the cost of distributing the outputs to customers. It's critical that a supply chain is effectively managed because an operation system depends on inputs. If inputs are not available for production, then nothing can be produced. If inputs are of poor quality, then it's not possible to produce quality outputs. And if the right quantity of inputs is not available, then the business can't meet the demand of its customers for the business's outputs. If any part of the supply chain breaks down, then the ability of the business to deliver its output to customers may well be compromised. Our learning intention specifically refers to 3 global considerations in operations management. These are the global sourcing of inputs, overseas manufacture, and global outsourcing. In addition, we're going to look at a 4th global consideration in operations management, which is global demand for outputs. The rest of this video deals with these 4 aspects of operations management. Let's start off with the global sourcing of inputs. The global sourcing of inputs refers to a business procuring, that is, purchasing, inputs from overseas suppliers. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term global sourcing of inputs and write this definition in there. Many Australian producers procure, that is, purchase, at least some of the inputs they need from overseas suppliers. For instance, Australian producers import vehicles, machinery, including computers, and oil from overseas, and they use these as inputs into the production of goods in Australia. There are a number of considerations that an Australian business must take into account where it globally sources inputs. Make sure that you include a summary of these considerations in your summary book. First, the political, economic and social conditions in the input supplier's country can affect the reliability of input supply to the Australian business. For example, political tensions between Australia and China over issues such as Chinese military activity in the South China Sea and whether Chinese companies should be allowed to own critical infrastructure in Australia like telecommunications networks has periodically resulted in disruptions to trade between Australia and China. This in turn has affected the ability of Australian businesses to obtain the inputs they need from China. Similarly, strikes at the input supplier's facility, for example, for better pay or better working conditions, can affect the supply of inputs by the input supplier to an Australian business. Second, it can be complex to coordinate a number of different input suppliers in different countries in a way that ensures that the inputs are delivered to the Australian business when they are required. This is because each supplier needs to manufacture the quantity of inputs that are necessary to meet the demand for the Australian business's outputs and to deliver those inputs to the Australian business in Australia in sufficient time to enable the Australian business to manufacture the output that's needed to meet its customers' requirements. Third, where inputs have to be moved from one country to another, there's a greater risk of disruption due to legal requirements such as customs checks and poor weather, which can delay shipping schedules. And fourthly, where input suppliers are overseas, it's more difficult for an Australian business to monitor whether those input suppliers are complying with their corporate social responsibility obligations. These obligations include treating their employees in an ethical manner by paying them a fair wage and providing safe working conditions, and producing the inputs in an environmentally sustainable manner by minimising waste and pollution. An Australian business can have its reputation severely damaged if it buys inputs from an input supplier who does not produce those inputs in an ethical and environmentally sustainable manner. This table sets out the advantages and disadvantages of globally sourcing inputs. Make sure that you include a copy of this table in your summary books. Globally sourcing inputs has three main advantages. First, it may be cheaper to buy inputs produced overseas than similar inputs produced in Australia. For example, China has lower wages than Australia, and so it can manufacture mass-produced goods, such as computers, more cheaply than Australia. Second, it might not be possible to buy the necessary inputs in Australia at all. For example, the reason Australia needs to import tyres, antibiotics, computers and telecommunications equipment is that many of these inputs are not produced in Australia. And third, globally sourcing inputs provides jobs, wages and economic development to less developed countries where the inputs are made in those countries. On the other hand, globally sourcing inputs has five main disadvantages. First, the country in which the inputs are produced might have an unstable political or economic system. For example, war or hyperinflation may make the supply of inputs from that country unreliable in the case of war or expensive in the case of hyperinflation. Second, as I've already explained, it's difficult for an Australian business to monitor an overseas input supplier's compliance with its corporate social responsibility obligations, and an Australian business's reputation can be severely damaged where it sources its inputs from an overseas input supplier who does not produce those inputs in an ethically and environmentally sustainable manner. Third, if the input supplier is in a different time zone to Australia or doesn't speak or write English very well, then communications between the Australian business and the input supplier can be difficult, and this may result in misunderstandings. Fourth, there may be delays in obtaining inputs from another country due to weather conditions, which affects things like shipping schedules, or the need to comply with export regulations, which requires customs checks. And fifth, where an Australian business obtains inputs from an overseas supplier, then this deprives the Australian workforce of jobs and wages because they aren't producing the inputs. Instead, an overseas supplier is producing those inputs. This brings us to the next two global considerations in operations management that we need to look at. These are overseas manufacture and global outsourcing. Overseas manufacture, also called offshoring, occurs where a business produces output in a country that is different to the country where the headquarters of the business is located. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term overseas manufacture and write this definition in there. In contrast, global outsourcing is where a business contracts out a specific business operation so that that business operation is performed by another business in a country overseas. Again, look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term global outsourcing and write this definition in there. It's very important not to confuse these two concepts. In overseas manufacture, the Australian business sets up and operates a production facility in another country. That is, it is the Australian business which manufactures its output in that other country. In contrast, in global outsourcing, the Australian business enters into an agreement with a business in another country. Under that agreement, it is this other business which produces output for the Australian business. This is not a situation where the Australian business itself is producing output in that overseas country. As you know, many Australian companies, such as energy companies and banks, service their Australian customers using call centres in countries such as the Philippines. This would be an example of overseas manufacture if the Australian company owned and operated the call centre in the Philippines. However, it would be an example of global outsourcing if the Australian company contracted with a business in the Philippines for the business in the Philippines to use its own call centre and its own employees to call customers of the Australian business on behalf of the Australian business. There are a number of considerations that an Australian business must take into account where it's undertaking overseas manufacture or global outsourcing. Make sure that you include a summary of these considerations in your summary books. First, where outputs have to be moved from one country to another, for example, as where they are produced in China but have to be transported to Australia for the Australian business to sell those outputs to its customers, then there is a greater risk of disruption to the supply of those outputs. This disruption can be caused by factors such as legal requirements, for example customs checks, or poor weather, which can delay shipping schedules. Second, it may be difficult for an Australian business to monitor the quality of the output that is produced in an overseas facility, whether that facility is operated by the Australian business, as in overseas manufacture, or by another business, as in global outsourcing. This is because the production is occurring outside Australia and is therefore not under the direct control of employees in Australia who are likely to be experts in quality management. The third consideration is relevant to overseas manufacture. Where an Australian business undertakes overseas manufacture, it is setting up and operating a production facility in another country. This other country will have a different political, economic, social and legal environment to Australia. This means that, for example, the Australian business will need to learn about and comply with all of the laws of this country that apply to it, such as employment, environmental and tax laws. The Australian business will also need to understand and accommodate the social customs that apply in that country, such as what is considered polite behaviour, and it may need to cope with people who don't speak English. The fourth consideration is relevant to global outsourcing. Where an Australian business's output is being produced on its behalf by an overseas manufacturer, it is more difficult for the Australian business to monitor whether that overseas manufacturer is complying with its corporate social responsibility obligations. These obligations include treating its employees in an ethical manner by paying them a fair wage and providing them with a safe workplace, and producing the output in an environmentally sustainable way by minimising waste and pollution. An Australian business can have its reputation severely damaged if it outsources the production of its output to an overseas manufacturer who does not produce that output in an ethical and environmentally sustainable manner. This table sets out the advantages and disadvantages of overseas manufacture and global outsourcing. Make sure that you include a copy of this table in your summary books. The table continues on this slide and the next two slides. On this slide, I have set out two advantages and two disadvantages of both overseas manufacture and global outsourcing. The first advantage of overseas manufacture and global outsourcing is that it may be cheaper to manufacture outputs overseas than in Australia. For example, China has lower wages than Australia, and so mass-produced goods, such as clothes, can be manufactured more cheaply in China than in Australia. Similarly, India has lower wages than Australia, and it also has an educated workforce. For this reason, many Australian companies have outsourced their IT and call centre functions to Indian companies. The second advantage of overseas manufacture and global outsourcing is that it might not be possible to access the skills needed to produce the output in Australia. For example, Australia has a shortage of aircraft maintenance engineers, and so some Australian airlines outsource their aircraft maintenance to Singapore and Malaysia, where there are aircraft maintenance engineers available to perform maintenance on those aircraft. On the other hand, a disadvantage of both overseas manufacture and global outsourcing is that the country in which the output is manufactured might not have or enforce laws for the protection of intellectual property rights. This means that there is little legal protection against other manufacturers in that country simply copying the output of the Australian business and selling it as their own. This is a particular problem in China. Many Australian and United States companies are cautious about manufacturing in China because there's little legal protection against other Chinese manufacturers copying their products and selling them at a cheaper price. In fact, this is a major cause of tension between the United States and China at the moment. Another disadvantage of both overseas manufacture and global outsourcing is that there may be delays in transporting the outputs from the country in which those outputs are manufactured to Australia. These delays could be caused by factors such as weather conditions, which affect shipping schedules, or export regulations, which require things such as customs checks. On this slide, I've set out two more advantages and three more disadvantages of both overseas manufacture and global outsourcing. An advantage of overseas manufacture and global outsourcing is that the country in which the manufacturing occurs may be located closer than Australia to some of the Australian business's customers. For example, if the Australian business sells its output into Asia, then production facilities that manufacture its output in Asia will be closer to the Australian business's Asian customers. It'll be quicker and cheaper to deliver that output from those production facilities directly to these Asian customers rather than to supply the Asian customers from Australia. However, a disadvantage of overseas manufacture and global outsourcing is that if the country in which the output is manufactured is in a different time zone to Australia, or is a country in which English is not widely understood, then there may be difficulties in communicating between the Australian business and the manufacturing facility, and this could result in misunderstandings. Another advantage of overseas manufacture and global outsourcing is that it provides jobs, wages, and economic development to less developed countries where the manufacturing takes place. However, this is at the expense of the Australian workforce because it means that jobs that could have been performed in Australia and wages that could have been paid to Australian workers are now being performed by and paid to overseas workers. Finally, as I've already described, it may be difficult for an Australian business to monitor the quality of production where that output is being produced at an overseas manufacturing facility. This will be an issue because poor quality output can damage a business's reputation. And here is the last slide that makes up this table of advantages and disadvantages. On this slide, I've set out one disadvantage that relates to overseas manufacture and one disadvantage that relates to global outsourcing. I've already discussed these disadvantages. A disadvantage that is specific to overseas manufacture is that where an Australian business undertakes overseas manufacturing, it's setting up and operating a production facility in another country. This other country will have a different political, economic, social and legal environment to Australia. This means that, for example, the Australian business will need to learn about and comply with all of the laws of this country that apply to it, such as employment, environmental and tax laws. The Australian business will also need to understand and accommodate the social customs that apply in that country, such as what is considered to be polite behaviour, and it may need to cope with people who don't speak English. A disadvantage that is specific to global outsourcing is that it is more difficult for an Australian business to monitor whether the overseas manufacturer is complying with its corporate social responsibility obligations. These obligations include treating its employees in an ethical manner by paying them a fair wage and providing them with safe working conditions, and producing the output in an environmentally sustainable way by minimising waste and pollution. An Australian business can severely damage its reputation if it outsources its production to an overseas manufacturer and that overseas manufacturer doesn't produce that output in an ethical and environmentally sustainable manner. The fourth and final global consideration in operations management that we need to look at is global demand for output. Many Australian businesses sell their output to customers overseas. This has become increasingly possible with the use of e-commerce facilities that allow customers to look at, order and pay for a business's products online and at any time. There are a number of considerations that a business must take into account where it sells its output to customers overseas. Make sure that you include a summary of these considerations in your summary books. First, the business needs to keep track of changes in global demand for its products. Changes in global demand can be caused by changes in customer tastes and requirements and by competitors developing new products. It can be difficult for a business to keep up with and to change its output in response to changes in customer demand, particularly where those customers are spread over a variety of countries. This is because customers in different countries might have different tastes and different requirements. Second, for similar reasons, it can be difficult for a business to keep up with and to change its output to accommodate customer concerns about corporate social responsibility where those customers are in different countries and are likely to have different corporate social responsibility concerns. Yet we know that customers are important stakeholders in a business and that one of the key factors that influences customers in their purchasing decisions is corporate social responsibility considerations. And the business must not just ensure that it complies with its corporate social responsibility obligations, but also that its input suppliers and any overseas manufacturers also comply with corporate social responsibility obligations. And third, Where the business's customers are spread across different countries, the Australian business will need to have in place delivery systems that deliver the business's output to those customers in a quick and cost-effective manner. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to describe global considerations in operations management, including global sourcing of inputs, overseas manufacture, global outsourcing, and an overview of supply chain management. Please now read the pages from the textbook referred to on the first slide in this video, and if you find any additional information in that reading that you consider to be useful, then supplement your Cornell notes with that information. Thank you for your attention.